President Donald Trump announced that the United States, together with France and Britain, launched airstrikes against Syrian targets in response to the chemical attack in Douma earlier this week. Trump said the targets are associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's government. Russian President Vladimir Putin condemned these airstrikes, calling them an act of aggression against a sovereign state. To consider the issues and consequences of these latest developments in Syria, I am joined in the studio by Hua Liming, former Chinese ambassador to Iran, Rick Dunham, visiting scholar at Tsinghua University. We'll also speak via satellite to Russian defense analyst Pavel Felgenhauer in Moscow and our correspondent in Damascus, Ala Ibrahim. That's our topic. This is Dialogue, and I'm Jonathan Betts. Gentlemen, it is great to have you with us today. So, Rick, let me start with you. President Trump says that this was a limited airstrike meant to prevent the further use of chemical weapons in Syria. Do you think it will work?
I doubt that it will work. I mean, I do agree it was limited. You could see that the targets were very carefully chosen. It was carefully chosen to avoid Russian troops, Iranian troops, or anything beyond the chemical weapons capabilities. But the last time that there was a strike, it didn't stop Assad, and you saw what happened just last week.
But even though these are more strikes and larger, you don't think it's going to make a difference?
No, because Donald Trump basically gave 3 days notice that he was going to strike. So if there were stockpiles, if there were other things he wanted to move, I think the Syrians and the Russians have moved whatever it would be.
Ambassador, do you think the Syrian president will feel the sting of these airstrikes?
Syrian President, I think it will be, of course, a very serious attack against Syria. And the Syrian got ready for these attacks. But I would say this kind of military attack against a sovereign state totally is illegal. Because according to the UN Charter, and which is the fruit of attempts of the nations of the world to stop the war and stop the fascism. I think that one of the rules of the UN Charter was that to respect the sovereignty of independent nations. And this time, I think the military attack against a sovereign state like Syria, just like the war, the aggression against Iraq, against Afghanistan, totally it's illegal.
But Ambassador, do you think that the president should be punished for this alleged chemical attack against his own people?
Well, this is the second point. It should be proved by evidence. Was chemical weapons used in Syria? The second problem, if those chemical weapons was used, who used that chemical weapons? So this evidence we have to be sure that the Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian government has used this chemical. Nobody can prove that. So without any improvement of all these things, the military attack started. For this point of view, I think this military attack should be called illegal.
Let me bring in Pavel into this conversation in Moscow, because Pavel, we've heard from Russia condemn this attack. They've raised the point that the ambassador has, is that it is unclear who precisely launched this chemical attack. What kind of response do you think we're going to see from Moscow?
Well, the verbal response is already will be rather harsh. The Russian President Vladimir Putin stated the basic Russian position that this is an act of aggression, that it cannot be excused by anything, and that's what Russia is going to say in the UN and in the Russian media and Russian officials. But the good news is, of course, that this attack did not provoke or any kind of Russian-American military standoff.
So you don't, Pavel, so you don't think that, Pavel, let me jump in real quickly. Pavel, I know there's a delay, so excuse me, but you don't think that, just to be clear, you don't think Moscow is going to escalate this and possibly retaliate against American troops?
Moscow, no, it will not, of course. And it was specifically, this attack was tailored that no one actually got into harm's way. The Russians gave prior notice to the Syrians to evacuate those facilities that were hit. So this was a kind of very expensive fireworks to prove a point, a kind of very symbolic action. And Russia, of course, did not even shoot at any American missiles per se, and of course is not intending or didn't shoot at American planes or American naval ships. But there will be problems ahead. I mean, what happened does not mean that if we avoided any kind of escalation to a direct Russian-American confrontation now, it doesn't mean the tension has gone away. The tension is going to rise. There's the possibility that some kind of local pro-Assad semi-independent groups will be getting attack American, British, and French special troops that are on the ground in Syria, to push them out of Syria, which of course Russia and Iran and Damascus want to happen. So that means, and then the Americans maybe will be hitting back much more forcefully if their troops are attacked on the ground by someone in Syria. So that means that the tension's not going away. The brinkmanship, the balancing on the brink of war will continue.
So let's talk about that, Rick. I mean, do you feel like that this could escalate here between these powers? We have Iran involved, we've got Russia, the United States, Syria.
I think it's possible. I mean, the good news in this is that it did not escalate today in a very tense 20-hour period. But you have unpredictable people. I mean, I will start with Bashar al-Assad and Donald Trump. They're very unpredictable. I think the best news out of this, if there could be any good news about military attacks, is that the military in Moscow and at the Pentagon acted maturely and acted to contain the potential for that. But again, as Pavel was saying, I agree with him completely. What happens if a group of Syrian soldiers attacks Americans or British? Then Donald Trump could unleash an attack. I mean, there are so many opportunities for mistakes that could spiral. But I think the good news was we saw some maturity in the military establishments.
But if you're saying that these strikes by Trump and the UK and France are not going to prevent future chemical attacks, right, are not a pain that the President Assad will feel, then why launch them? Well,
I think it was, number one, symbolic. Number two, just think of the week in politics in Washington, D.C. that Donald Trump has had. I mean, it's been scandal, scandal, scandal. It's been the book that was written by James Comey. This changed the subject. I don't want to be too cynical, because he did talk about this for 3 days, that he was going to respond.
But it's not just Trump. He had the support of his European allies as well.
That is correct. And I do think that they felt it even more strongly than he did, that you had to do something. I mean, it leads to a major discussion. The ambassador was talking about this, about the role of the United Nations and the role of international law, because France and Britain and Donald Trump believed to act unilaterally, to act extra-legally, while Russia, China say go through the UN process.
But Ambassador, the complaint has been made that the United Nations is not really doing anything. This war has dragged on for 7 years. Many lives have been lost, many more have suffered. If the United Nations is not really doing anything to end the war, shouldn't other countries step in?
The United Nations has been established just for political settlement of the disputes among the nations. And unfortunately, United Nations, or fortunately, United Nations is not the world government. And United Nations cannot rule. Even if the resolution is passed by the Security Council, sovereign states can say no to that. So we have a United Nations, and we have many constructive roles played by United Nations, but United Nations cannot rule the sovereign states, especially the big power like United States.
So who should step in to try to end this conflict?
I think the wisdom, political wisdom, should step in for the settlement of that. And I'm sure Donald Trump is not initiating a war like the Iraqi war or the Afghanistan war. It's just a very limited military actions. And I think the target was just to tell the American public that I have done something. Of course, it's a message to Israel and Saudi Arabia that we are working with you and we're standing with you. Of course, this is a message also to Bashar al-Assad's government that avoiding to be too close to Russia and Iran.
Rick?
Well, one thing with Bashar al-Assad, this chemical attack came almost immediately after Donald Trump said the U.S. should remove all of its troops from Syria. So the most logical assumption was that he thought U.S. was going to leave. He had free rein to do what he wanted. But the point that we've been talking about with the United Nations, this kind of situation is not what the UN is built for. The UN needs consensus of the major powers of the Security Council to act. And so there are many cases of mass murder within countries that don't have any kind of UN action. If you look back to Rwanda. I mean, the last time I remember with UN action was in Bosnia and in the former Yugoslavia, but that was one where the Soviet Union and Russia and the United States concurred at least that something should be done.
Pavel, I want to get back to the point of these chemical weapons attacks. I want to get the Russian perspective from you there in Moscow. I mean, from the Russian side, what needs to happen to make sure that more people are not gassed to death in Syria?
The Russian, of course, position of the Russian military and the Russian government that there was no chemical attack, that this was all staged, that actually the British did it, that the British organized simulation.
Let me interrupt you there. Has there been any evidence presented by Russia to back up that claim?
Well, the day before there were some kind of people from Douma in eastern Ghouta who were giving on tape evidence and saying, yes, that they were present when this was staged. About the British, I don't think that there is any evidence, and I don't really believe that narrative, but yes, that's what the Russian authorities are saying. So the Russians are pushing back that there was no attack, and if there was something, it was a simulation organized by the nasty Brits. So I don't see right now that the Russian military can anywhere turn face and say, no, the Assad regime is doing something bad and using chemical weapons. And of course, there's this Salisbury British incident with the Skripals and the alleged use of nerve agent by the Russians. So the Russians are in a very defensive position. They will not agree. And that's how it's going to be. Actually, of course, in Syria, by some estimates, up to 500,000 people perished in this over 7 years long civil war. Of them from chemical weapons, I don't know, maybe a couple of hundred, which of course is also terrible, but it's a very, very small portion compared to how much people have been killed by other means.
Yeah, and I've heard
so concentrating just on chemical weapons is maybe not that really important. You should not take them into perspective, how many people are killed allegedly by chemical weapons and how many people are just being killed.
Right. I've heard that concern over my coverage of Syria, that the Syrians are upset because they feel like the world only cares when there's a chemical weapons attack, but barrel bombs could be launched every day and many people could die, and there's not that global reaction. But Rick, I want to bring you into that conversation that he just raised, the sensational claim that perhaps President Assad was not behind this chemical weapons attack. The argument has been made from a lot of Arab countries that you look at what happened in Iraq with the weapons of mass destruction, the claim being made there that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction turned out not to be true. They point to that as evidence to show that perhaps these claims that Assad did not launch these chemical weapons, perhaps there's something there. Does that hold water?
Well, with all due respect, I think that's garbage. I mean, I think it's ridiculous. This was not the United States. This was not the Trump administration that said that this was Assad. There was evidence. It was reporters on the ground. You could see the helicopters, video of Syrian helicopters. I mean, it's so obvious that, yes, it hasn't gone through the formal process of the United Nations. Okay? In 2 years, the United Nations will say, yes, it was chemical weapons. That won't do any good. We'll have had 3 more horrific situations, and who knows where the Civil War will be. I think it's ridiculous to get into this kind of a debate over was it a chemical attack and who was behind it. I think we can't say with legal certainty 100%, but the circumstantial evidence is so strong that this was the Assad regime. But I think that this is an argument that is unnecessary. We should say, where do we go going forward? How do we bring the Syrian civil war to an end? How do we bring the Assad regime to the bargaining table, or if not, have an exit strategy where the war will end? We haven't even started with a situation with the Kurds. You look at the map of Syria, Kurds control about 1/3 of the country. What is going to happen when the U.S. withdraws and you have a Kurdish de facto nation in northeastern Syria and Assad in control of the rest? I think this is why we have to have serious negotiations.
So let's talk about that. I mean, the overall U.S. strategy here for Syria, there has been confusion over that and a lot of criticism about that. Do you think that these airstrikes impacts Trump's strategy when it comes to Syria and the possibility of him pulling American troops out?
Well, that's assuming that there was a strategy. I mean, I think if there is any strategy, it was that Donald Trump wanted to disengage. I think he was ready at the beginning of his presidency to hand Syria over to Russia. But things have happened over the past year. His advisors have changed. His own views of the world have evolved. And right now, I think where he was certain going in what he wanted to do now, he's very confused. And the signals that are coming out of the White House are so different from day to day.
Ambassador?
I think the Russians are going to very cautious about that. I just had read the President Putin's speech that he has been condemned this military action, but he didn't talk about the retaliation of the Russians. And I think one of the reasons that Rick has just been talked about, I think for the Syrian government, I don't see any reasons to use chemical weapons in this period, because Syrian government is winning, and no side of war, parties of war, will use chemical weapons when they are winning the war. And
so just to be clear, you doubt the claims that President Assad launched these chemical weapons?
I don't think that it's evidence still should be done. We see OPCW delegation is in Lebanon, and tomorrow maybe they will.
But they are not investigating who launched the weapons, only if they were used.
If they are used, of course, this is the first question. If the chemical weapon is used, and the second question is, if used, who used that? These two questions still remain unanswered.
And so how come you're not convinced about that? Especially we heard from Rick, who's pretty forceful about this, and other people as well.
When we look at the history, through 2017 and 2013, when the chemical weapons was used in Syria, and the Syrian government was winning the war. And especially on the point that when the Syrian government was winning the war, some news about chemical weapons happened. And this time again, when Syrian government is winning the war, again the chemical weapons issue is I think there must be some groups or some influence in the Middle East that keep the United States in Syria not to leave that area. So to create some chemical issues which can be the red line of the United States. So this is my take of the chemical weapons issue.
So Pavel, I want to go back to this brewing confrontation between the United States and Russia that we've been discussing here. The UN Secretary General says a Cold War could come back with a vengeance here. Do you believe that we're on the brink of a new Cold War era?
No, actually, I believe that we are already in a Cold War, and maybe that's good news, because Cold War is much better than hot war, especially kind of, God forbid, nuclear war. So that's why maybe not that bad a message. But the confrontation, yes, will continue. And yes, it's mostly fueled by internal problems in Washington and actually also in Moscow, where we have our own party of war and party of peace, and where Russia comes from here, and the new government is going to be established in May when President Putin takes over officially for his next 6 years. And there's a very hot discussion on should defense spending be cut or should it be expanded, and a kind of brinkmanship, balancing on the brink, is maybe some of their parties interested in that, possibly in Moscow and possibly in Washington, because it's really ridiculous to have a situation where we're very close to an actual hot war between Russia and America just because of some people who were allegedly poisoned 46 people in Douma in Ghouta, in the middle of nowhere. I mean, the threats that this incident had created are too big to be just the fruit of the Syrian conflict.
But Pavel, you must admit that I mean, these are 40 lives, you know, killed in a very horrific manner. That something must be done about it. Yes.
Well, yes, actually, yes, and something has been done, because previously at an alleged attacks in Syria, they were using apparently sarin and other kind of more sophisticated and much more deadly weapons. And here it was apparently chlorine gas. And chlorine gas is not actually really a forbidden substance. It's produced by industry in all countries of the world, used even in households to clean dishes, I don't know, anything like that. I mean, so this is not very sophisticated attack, if it did happen. And yes, it may have some tactical advantages, but as I say, if you look at the bigger picture of what's happening in Syria, yes, of course, 46 lives lost and people didn't die, but they were injured. That's very, very tragic and bad. But in Syria, that happens every day and continues to happen. And so you should take that into perspective.
So, Rick, let's go back to the Cold War mentality here. You know, how does this end? Where does this go?
Well, first, I really don't like the Cold War comparison. Cold War is in capital C, capital W, that we lived through from 1945 to 1991, because Russia is not the Soviet Union. I mean, Putin is not Brezhnev or Stalin. And this is not a battle of ideologies, of capitalism versus Marxist-Leninist communism. This is a Cold War, lowercase c, where Russia and the West are at a stalemate, are probing at each other, and a war that is a new war because it's the cyber war, the 2016 American election, the Russian interference in that, and the Russian ties to elections in France, the Brexit election, the spy situation in England. So that's where I think we have to look, and that is, this is a new kind of war, and it's an asymmetrical war because Donald Trump is lobbing missiles. The Russians are dealing in cyberspace. And I think that, yes, it is a new kind of war, but I don't think we should go back to that 20th century mentality that this is reliving the Cold War.
But apparently we're already there. And so how do we stop this? How do we get out of it?
Well, I think what you're going to need is some adjustments in the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin is going to have to decide what he wants to do to improve Russia's economy as well as the standing in the world. And then the West is going to have to realize Putin is not going to go away. Russia is not a great economic power like China, but it is a force to be reckoned with. It is a cyber power, and it is a military power.
I want to go to our correspondent, Alla Ibrahim, who is on the phone for us in Damascus. Alla, thanks for being with us on Dialogue. I want to get your reaction there since you were on the ground inside Syria. These U.S.-led airstrikes here, do you get the impression that they might actually tip the scales here and might inflict some damage on President Assad?
Well, this is what many Syrians were concerned about, that such an American intervention would cause a momentum that the rebels could capitalize on and launch new offensives against the Syrian government to try and make new gains. But what happened in the past few hours is that these strikes were somewhat limited As a result, they did not actually compromise the government's ability to mobilize troops and actually maintain its position as having the upper hand in the fighting across the country. As a result, if the strikes are limited to what we have seen in the past few hours, then they won't have an effect on the course of the battles between the government and the rebels, nor will they change the front lines between the two parties. But on the long run, strikes such as this one, and this is not the first time, this is the second time the U.S. carries out such a strike against the Syrian government, strikes of this one will help undermine the Syrian government, and at some point will make the government much more vulnerable to attacks from rebels and from other radical groups operating within the country.
Undermine the Syrian government. That's a very interesting perspective, Ambassador, especially since we heard from Pavel earlier calling this just an expensive show of fireworks.
I think for Syrian government, it was a military attack and it was a threat, but I think it has been very limited. And I just think the Syrian government, both the Russians and the Iranians, they know that this will, as Donald Trump has announced, that this is a one-off attack. So limited, and I'm sure that the retaliation from Russian and Iranian, there will be some retaliation, but it will be not serious. And President Putin and the Iranians have been very cautious about the retaliation.
So Rick, we're nearing the end of our show here. I want to get your thoughts here on the larger picture. As we've mentioned, this has been an ongoing war. A lot of people have suffered. How does this end? Where do we go from here?
Well, I see the non-Kurdish parts of Syria being reunited under the current government. The question is long-term whether Bashar al-Assad is in power or whether someone is brought in a political solution who can bring an end to the bloodshed. What happens with Kurdish situation? Uncertain. And then I think the bigger question of the proxy wars of the Iranians and the Saudis is a bigger issue that will not be decided here. But I think in the short run, there will be pain on Assad, but there's not an attempt by the Western powers to militarily go in and take him out.
Ambassador, do you see a future for Syria without President Assad?
I think only that the solution is a political solution, and an inclusive government should be organized. If Bashar Assad and the current Syrian government is excluded from the future, I think neither the Russian and nor Iranian will accept it, and the Syrians themselves will not accept it. So I think that some political solution, some compromise has to be done between the Syrians themselves.
And Allah, I will give you the last question, since you were on the ground and best equipped to answer this. I mean, what is the future for Syria? How does this bloodshed end from your perspective? We have about, and we lost Allah, sadly. So we'll probably end it right there. I appreciate your time. Rick Dunham, Ambassador Hua Liming, Pavel Felgenhauer, Allah Ibrahim, thank you all for your perspective. An ongoing bloody war, no clear end in sight, and a very, very complicated situation for a lot of people on the ground there in Syria. Thank you so much. And I'm Jonathan Betts, in for our dialogue. We appreciate you staying with us tonight. Keep it right here. There is still much more ahead on CGTN.